There is a place in Northern California where sound disappears, not because it is silent, but because it is smothered. Snow presses down on the forest until even footsteps seem unwelcome. Trees stand motionless, their branches heavy with ice. Roads narrow into nothing, and the world feels smaller, colder, and harder to escape. High in the Plumas National Forest, far from towns and highways, sits a trailer. It is unremarkable: metal walls, a single door, narrow windows that look out into miles of wilderness. It was built for convenience, not survival, a temporary shelter for Forest Service workers during warmer months. It was never meant to hold a man through winter, and it was never meant to become a grave. When the door was opened in the spring of 1978, the cold inside felt different, stale, still, as though time had stopped moving the moment the door was last closed. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no evidence of panic. Everything inside the trailer appeared oddly calm. At the center of the room was a bed. On that bed lay the body of a man. He was wrapped tightly in blankets, layered carefully, deliberately, as though someone had tried to protect him from the cold. By the time he was found, his body had wasted away to nearly half its normal weight. The cause of death was not freezing. It was starvation. This detail would haunt everyone who studied the case, because starvation does not happen quickly. It happens slowly. It requires time, and it requires survival long enough for hunger to take over. The windows of the trailer had been broken, but not violently. They were shattered one at a time, carefully. Paper and cloth were stuffed into the openings, an improvised attempt to control the cold. The stove had been used. The propane tank was present. The trailer contained dozens of unopened cans of food, enough to keep someone alive for weeks, possibly longer. None of it had been eaten. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The man inside the trailer had warmth, he had shelter, he had food, and yet he starved. Outside the trailer, the forest revealed nothing. Months of snow had erased every trace of how he arrived or where he might have gone. No footprints remained. No clear path led back to a road. The trailer sat miles from the nearest town, miles from the place where a car would later be found abandoned, higher in elevation, colder, deeper into the mountains. This was not a place someone reached by accident, which meant one thing with certainty: at least one man had walked this far into the wilderness, alive. But he did not come alone, because months earlier, 5 men had vanished together. They were not hikers, they were not survivalists, they were not equipped for winter travel. They were 5 ordinary men from a quiet town called Yuba City, California, and on February 24, 1978, they went to watch a basketball game. They never came home. Most disappearances begin with a single mistake, a wrong turn, a missed call, a moment of panic. The Yuba County 5 did not disappear like that. Their story did not end in one place. It fractured. Pieces of it surfaced over time, scattered across miles of frozen terrain. A car abandoned on a mountain road, bodies found far apart, a shelter filled with untouched food, and one man who was never found at all. What makes this case endure is not simply that 5 men vanished, it is how they vanished. The decisions they made do not follow instinct, they do not follow logic, and they do not follow one another. A working car was abandoned. Men capable of walking long distances gave up while others pressed deeper into the mountains. Resources were ignored, and time, instead of bringing clarity, only deepened the confusion. For decades, investigators and researchers have returned to the same questions. Why did they leave the car? Why did they walk uphill? Why did they split up? Why did a man starve in a trailer full of food? And why did the most capable of them disappear completely? Each question leads to another. Each answer collapses under scrutiny. Because this is not a mystery defined by missing evidence, it is defined by evidence that refuses to agree with itself. 5 men vanished on the same night, but they did not die together. They did not stay together, and they did not make the same choices. This alone sets the Yuba County 5 apart. Most survival stories follow a pattern. This one does not. Instead, it behaves like something unfinished, like a story interrupted before its final sentence. The families felt this from the beginning. Their sons were predictable. They followed routines. They returned home when they said they would. They did not wander. They did not seek danger, which makes what happened next so deeply unsettling, because whatever happened in the mountains did not align with who these men were. The night they disappeared was not dramatic. There were no storms at lower elevations, no warnings, no sense of urgency. They left town as they had many times before. They expected to return home before morning. Some had commitments the next day. One had plans to attend a basketball tournament. None of them packed overnight bags. None of them said goodbye. They did not plan to vanish, and yet, by morning, they were gone. Days passed before the full scope of the situation became clear. By the time search efforts began in earnest, winter had already tightened its grip on the mountains. Snow erased tracks. The wind swallowed sound. The forest closed in. When spring finally arrived, it did not bring answers. It brought fragments, a body in a trailer, remains scattered miles apart, and one absence that could not be explained. The deeper investigators looked, the more the story resisted order. Each discovery contradicted the last. Each explanation solved one problem while creating another. This is why the case still unsettles those who learn about it, not because of what is known, but because of what can never be reconciled. Survival without escape, shelter without rescue, movement without direction, capability without outcome. The Yuba County 5 did not vanish all at once. They disappeared slowly, decision by decision, step by step, into a landscape that punishes hesitation and magnifies uncertainty. Somewhere between fear and hope, logic broke down, and whatever happened in those mountains left no single truth behind, only silence, and a trailer that should have meant survival, but instead became the place where the mystery took shape. This is not the story of how 5 men died. It is the story of how 5 men made choices that still defy explanation, and how a quiet night in Northern California became one of the strangest unresolved mysteries in American history.
What makes the Yuba County 5 disappearance so unsettling is not the absence of answers. It is the presence of too many that refuse to agree with one another. Most missing persons cases eventually settle into a shape. A probable explanation emerges, even if certainty never does. Accidents follow patterns. Panic follows instinct. Survival situations tend to reveal a clear point where everything went wrong. This case never does. Instead, it behaves like something unfinished, as though the story stopped mid-sentence. 5 men vanish on the same night, yet their final days do not mirror one another. Their decisions do not align. Their fates unfold separately, scattered across miles of wilderness, contradicting what instinct and logic suggest should have happened. The deeper investigators and researchers looked, the more fractured the narrative became. If the men were simply lost, why did they continue deeper into the mountains instead of turning back? If they were afraid, why abandon a functioning vehicle that offered shelter, visibility, and the best chance of rescue? If they were disoriented, how did at least one of them manage to reach a remote trailer stocked with food and supplies? And if survival was possible, why did it ultimately fail in such an inexplicable way? These are not abstract questions. They are questions rooted in physical evidence, measurable distances, documented weather conditions, confirmed timelines. The Mercury Montego was not disabled. It was not stuck beyond recovery. The road conditions, while snowy, were not impassable. Other vehicles traveled the same road that night and made it through. The car could have been used as shelter. It could have been seen from the air. It could have kept them alive long enough for help to arrive. Leaving it was not an inevitable outcome. It was a choice. And once that choice was made, everything that followed became harder to explain. The men walked uphill, away from the direction of safety, deeper into unfamiliar terrain. They did so at night, in freezing temperatures, without proper winter clothing, and without any clear destination. At some point, they separated, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually over distance and time. This is where the case begins to defy expectation. In survival situations, people tend to stay together. Groups fragment only under extreme circumstances: panic, injury, group dynamics under pressure, or a belief that help lies in different directions. Yet there is no evidence of violence, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone was forced away from the group. What remains is the uncomfortable possibility that the decisions were voluntary, even if driven by fear or confusion. That possibility has made the case difficult to discuss without misunderstanding, because from the beginning, assumptions followed the men into the mountains, simplifications, labels, quiet judgments. But those assumptions obscure the reality of who these men were and how they lived. They were not reckless. They were not prone to impulsive behavior. They did not take risks for excitement or curiosity. They lived structured lives. They followed routines. They relied on one another, which makes their final choices all the more difficult to reconcile. Another element that resists explanation is time. This was not a single-night tragedy. The evidence indicates that at least one man survived for weeks, long enough to adapt to his environment, long enough to try to stay warm, long enough to make deliberate decisions. That length of survival suggests clarity, not immediate panic, and yet the outcome suggests paralysis, inaction, waiting. This contradiction lies at the heart of the mystery. How does someone remain alive, functional, and surrounded by resources, yet fail to save themselves? And how do 5 men begin a journey together only to end it so differently? For investigators, the case quickly became one of conflicting interpretations. Some focused on environmental factors: the weather, the terrain, the darkness, the elevation. Others looked at psychological explanations: fear, stress, group dynamics under pressure. Others still wondered whether something external had influenced their actions: an encounter, a perceived threat, a misunderstanding that escalated beyond control. Each explanation accounted for something. None accounted for everything. The families sensed this early on. From the moment the men were reported missing, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, not just about where they were, but about how the case was being understood. Questions were asked, assumptions made, conclusions hinted at before evidence had been found. But those closest to the men knew something was wrong with the narrative being formed. These were not men who disappeared easily. They were known in their community, recognized, accounted for. When they did not return home, it was immediately noticed, and when days passed without answers, fear gave way to disbelief. The families searched not only for their sons and brothers, but for a version of events that made sense. What they found, instead, was silence. No witnesses who saw them leave the road, no calls for help, no trail to follow. As weeks passed, that silence became part of the story. It shaped how the case was perceived, how it was reported, how it was remembered. And yet the silence did not mean nothing had happened. It meant that whatever had happened occurred beyond view, beyond record, and beyond easy explanation. The Yuba County Five did not leave behind a single defining moment of catastrophe. They left behind fragments: a car in the wrong place, footsteps swallowed by snow, a trail that led uphill instead of home, a shelter that offered survival but delivered death, and a man who was never found. This fragmentation is why the case refuses to resolve itself. It does not present a clear villain. It does not offer a simple lesson. It does not end with a single tragic mistake. Instead, it forces uncomfortable questions about human behavior under stress, about how fear and confusion alter judgment, and about how easily a familiar world can become unrecognizable. To understand this case, it is not enough to examine where the men were found. You have to understand where they came from, the lives they lived, the routines they followed, the expectations they carried into that night. Because what happened in the mountains did not begin there. It began in a place where order mattered, where predictability was safety, where 5 men lived lives defined by consistency, trust, and community. To understand why their disappearance shattered so many assumptions, it is necessary to step away from the forest and return to the town they called home. A quiet place, an ordinary place, a place called Yuba City, California. Yuba City, California, in the late 1970s was a quiet place. It sat low and flat in the Sacramento Valley, surrounded by farmland, orchards, and long, straight roads that rarely surprised anyone. The rhythms of the town were predictable. Mornings began early, evenings ended early. People noticed when something changed. It was the kind of place where routines mattered. For many residents, life followed a steady pattern: work, home, church, community events. The same faces at the same grocery stores, the same cars parked in the same driveways. For 5 men who lived there, routine was not just comfort, it was stability. They were known in the community, not famous, not remarkable, just familiar. People recognized them because they showed up where they were expected to be, on time, every time. They lived with family members who helped them structure their days. They participated in local programs designed to support adults with developmental disabilities. They worked small jobs. They played basketball together. They attended events together. Their lives were organized, predictable, and anchored in trust. Jack Madruga was the driver. He lived with his mother and was known for being cautious and responsible. He cared deeply about his belongings, especially his car, a tan Mercury Montego that he kept clean and well-maintained. He rarely let anyone else drive it. He planned his trips carefully. He did not deviate from routes without reason. People who knew Jack described him as careful to the point of rigidity. He liked things done a certain way. He followed rules. He avoided unnecessary risks. William Sterling was gentle and soft-spoken. He had an easy smile and a friendly demeanor that made people comfortable around him. He relied heavily on others for guidance and reassurance, especially in unfamiliar situations. He trusted the people close to him completely. Bill did not wander. He did not make impulsive decisions. He preferred to stay with the group, follow instructions, and stick to plans. Ted Weiher was tall and physically strong, with a presence that often surprised people who didn't know him well. Despite his imposing stature, Ted depended deeply on structure and routine. Sudden changes cost him stress. He struggled when plans shifted unexpectedly. Familiar environments made him feel safe. Unfamiliar ones did not. Ted's physical strength often led people to assume he was more capable than he felt, but emotionally he relied heavily on the predictability of his daily life. Jack Huett lived with his parents and was known as dependable and kind. He was close to his family and rarely strayed far from home without explanation. He followed schedules, he kept commitments. When he said he would be somewhere, he was there. Jack was not known to take risks or challenge authority. He did what was expected of him and found comfort in that. Then there was Mathias.
Gary stood apart from the others in subtle but important ways. He was a former soldier, having served in the U.S. Army. He had lived independently at times. He had navigated unfamiliar environments before. Physically, he was capable. Mentally, he was resourceful. Gary also struggled with mental health challenges and was prescribed medication, but he was known to function well when properly medicated. He was street smart, alert, and capable of taking care of himself. If anyone in the group could have handled an emergency, it was Gary. The 5 men shared a bond that went beyond convenience. They trusted one another. They relied on one another. They spent their free time together by choice. Basketball was a central part of that bond. They played regularly. They attended games. They practiced together. They looked forward to tournaments and trips that broke the monotony of daily routine in safe, planned ways. On Friday, February 24, 1978, they had plans. They were going to Chico, California, to watch a college basketball game. It was an event they had anticipated, not spontaneous, not reckless, planned in advance. Jack Madruga agreed to drive. The route was familiar. The timing was reasonable. They were expected home that night. Some of the men had obligations the morning after. One had plans to attend a basketball tournament in Sacramento. None of them packed overnight bags. None of them told their families they would be late. This was not a night designed for unpredictability. The drive from Yuba City to Chico was straightforward. Flat roads, well-traveled highways, a route that required little thought. Everything about the plan suggested normalcy. And that is what makes what followed so difficult to accept. Because when the 5 men left Yuba City that evening, nothing about their behavior suggested they were preparing for danger. They were dressed for a short trip, light jackets, casual clothes, nothing meant for extended exposure to cold or snow. They carried no survival gear, no maps, no emergency supplies. They had no reason to. The event itself was uneventful. Their team lost, but witnesses later recalled seeing the men afterwards in good spirits, calm, relaxed, laughing. There were no signs of distress or agitation, no arguments, no urgency. They got into Jack's car and left Chico late that night. This moment is important because it represents the last time all 5 men were seen together, alive and behaving normally. The drive home should have taken them west, back toward Yuba City. Instead, at some point after leaving Chico, they turned east, towards the mountains. This decision alone would later become one of the haunting elements of the case, not because it was impossible to make a wrong turn, but because of who made it. Jack Madruga did not make wrong turns casually. He was careful, methodical, protective of his car. Gary Mathias knew the area better than most. He had traveled extensively. He understood geography. The others trusted them. And yet, the car headed in the wrong direction. The road they took led upward, away from the valley floor, toward higher elevation, colder temperatures, and snow-covered terrain. There was nothing along that route that would have drawn them intentionally. No destinations they were known to frequent, no friends, no landmarks they would have been seeking. The farther they drove, the worse conditions became. The temperature dropped, snow thickened, the road narrowed. At any point, they could have turned around. At any point, they could have stopped. But they didn't. Why they continued remains unknown. Some have suggested confusion, others fatigue. Still others believe that the road would eventually loop back. But none of those explanations fully account for the persistence of the decision. Because this was not a brief mistake, it was a sustained choice. The road climbed higher, deeper into the Sierra Nevada. The landscape changed. Familiar farmland gave way to forest and rock. And eventually, the car stopped. Not because it was disabled, not because it was wrecked, but because the road ahead grew worse. What happened next would define the outcome of everything that followed. But before the car was found, before the forest closed in, before the mountains claimed their silence, there was a moment when the 5 men were still together, still alive, and still capable of turning back. That moment passed unnoticed, and when the men did not return home that night, their absence sent ripples through a town where absence was rare. In Yuba City, people noticed, families waited, morning came, and the routines that once defined safety began to fracture.
February 24th, 1978, began like any other Friday. For the families of the 5 men, it was an ordinary day shaped by routine and expectation. There was no sense of unease, no reason to worry. The plan was simple and familiar. Drive to Chico, watch the basketball game, return home late but safely. Jack Madruga's mother expected to hear the car pull into the driveway sometime after midnight. Jack Huett's parents expected him home before morning. Ted Weiher had commitments the next day. William Sterling's family assumed he would follow the schedule he always followed. Gary Mathias had plans of his own for the weekend. None of them anticipated a delay. The men left Yuba City in the early evening, driving north toward Chico. The weather at lower elevations was cold but manageable. Winter had settled into the valley, but nothing about the conditions suggested danger. The drive was uneventful. They arrived in Chico with time to spare and joined the crowd at California State University, Chico, where the basketball game was being played. The stands were filled with spectators. The atmosphere was relaxed. The night passed without incident. Their team lost, but the loss did not dampen their spirits. Witnesses later recalled seeing the 5 men after the game. They appeared calm, friendly, and unhurried. There were no signs of distress, no arguments, no indication that anything was wrong. This detail would become important later, because it establishes that the men did not leave Chico in a state of panic or agitation. They were not fleeing something. They were not upset. They were simply heading home. At some point late that night, the men got back into Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego and left Chico. The exact time is uncertain, but it was late enough that most of the roads were quiet and the town had begun to settle. The drive home should have been straightforward. From Chico, the most direct route back to Yuba City leads west and south, descending out of the foothills and returning to the flat valley floor. It is a route the men had taken before. Instead, they went east, toward Orville, toward the mountains. The reason for this decision has never been confirmed. There was no known destination along that route that would have appealed to the group, no late-night diners they frequented, no friends or family members they were known to visit, no events scheduled in that direction. As the car traveled farther east, the terrain began to change. The road climbed gradually at first, winding through foothills and forests. The temperature dropped. Snow appeared along the edges of the pavement. This was not unfamiliar territory to locals, but it was not where the 5 men had intended to be. The road they followed eventually became the Orville-Quincy Road, a narrow mountain route that rises sharply into the Sierra Nevada. In winter, it is often treacherous. Snowstorms can appear suddenly. Visibility can vanish without warning. On that night, the weather worsened as they climbed. Snow fell steadily. The road narrowed. Ice formed along the surface. Other drivers later reported seeing a car similar to Jack's traveling along the road late that night. Some recalled the vehicle moving slowly, cautiously, as if the driver was unsure of conditions ahead. At some point, the car reached an elevation where turning around would have required careful maneuvering. Snowbanks lined the road. The darkness was complete. Still, the car continued. This persistence is one of the most difficult aspects of the case to explain, because there were multiple opportunities to stop, multiple places to turn back, multiple moments when the safest decision would have been obvious, yet the car kept climbing. Eventually, the road conditions deteriorated enough that the car could not continue safely. The Mercury Montego came to a stop near a snowbank. It did not crash. It was not stuck beyond recovery. It was simply parked. The engine was off. The headlights were off. The car sat there in silence, surrounded by forest and snow. This moment marks the final point at which the 5 men were together in relative safety. Inside the car, they were protected from the elements. They had shelter.
They had visibility. They had the ability to wait for daylight or flag down help. Remaining with the vehicle would have dramatically increased their chances of survival, but they did not stay. Instead, the 5 men left the car and walked into the darkness. Why they did this remains one of the central mysteries of the case. Some have suggested they believed help was nearby. Others panicked. Others still thought that something convinced them the car was no longer safe. What is known is that they left Chico in walking uphill, away from the direction of Orville and Yuba City, deeper into the mountains. This direction matters. Downhill lay lower elevations, warmer temperatures, and eventually populated areas. Uphill lay snow, isolation, and miles of uninhabited wilderness. And yet, uphill is the path they chose. The decision to leave the car transformed an uncomfortable situation into a life-threatening one. As they walked, the cold intensified, snow deepened, visibility diminished. They were dressed for a short evening trip, not an overnight ordeal in freezing conditions. None of them carried heavy winter coats or boots suitable for deep snow. Their footprints would have been visible at first, but snowfall would soon erase them. At some point after leaving the car, the group began to spread out. Not dramatically at first, just enough for distance to grow. The reasons for this separation are unknown. Fatigue, confusion, differences in pace, disagreements about direction. No one knows. What is clear is that the unity that defined the group in Yuba City began to fracture in the mountains. The road disappeared behind them, the forest closed in, and the night grew colder. Back in Yuba City, hours passed unnoticed. Families slept, morning approached, and the expectation that the men would return home quietly expired. By the time the sun rose on February 25th, something had already gone terribly wrong, but no one knew it yet. The 5 men were missing, and the mountains had already begun to keep their secret.
The road they chose that night was not forgiving. The Oroville-Quincy Road climbs steadily into the Sierra Nevada, winding through dense forest and rising elevation. In daylight and good weather, it is challenging but manageable. In winter, at night, it becomes something else entirely. Snow does not simply fall here. It accumulates, it drifts, it reshapes the landscape until familiar landmarks vanish. As the 5 men walked away from the car, they entered an environment that offered no margin for error. The temperature dropped further as elevation increased. Breath crystallized in the air. Snow packed beneath their feet, uneven and unpredictable. With each step, movement became more difficult, more exhausting. They had no clear destination, no map, no visible lights ahead, only the road stretching upward into darkness. The decision to walk uphill remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Instinct suggests the opposite. Downhill leads toward warmth, toward lower elevation, toward the valley where people live. Uphill leads into isolation. Yet this is the direction they followed. Some have suggested the men believed the road would lead to a lodge or ranger station. Others have theorized that fear of sliding back down icy slopes kept them moving forward. Still others have wondered whether confusion distorted their sense of direction entirely. But regardless of the reason, the result was the same. Each step took them farther from help. As they walked, fatigue set in quickly. Snow is deceptive. It looks soft, manageable, but it resists movement, draining energy with each step. Progress becomes slow, muscles burn, breathing grows shallow. For men unprepared for such conditions, exhaustion would have arrived fast. The road itself offered little protection. Trees crowded the edges, snowbanks rose high on either side in places. Wind cut through gaps in the forest, stripping heat from exposed skin. There was no shelter along the immediate stretch of road, no buildings, no cabins, no places to rest, only darkness. At some point, the group's cohesion weakened, not abruptly, gradually. The stronger walkers may have moved ahead, those struggling may have fallen behind. Snow and darkness made communication difficult. Distance grew. It is here that the psychological strain of the situation becomes critical. Fear does not always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as urgency, a belief that movement is safer than stillness, that stopping means surrender. In such conditions, the idea of pressing forward can feel logical, even when it is not. The men may have believed that something lay ahead, a turn, a structure, a place of warmth. The alternative, turning back, would have required admitting that they were lost. That realization alone can paralyze. Snow continued to fall. Tracks disappeared almost as quickly as they were made. The road behind them became indistinct, blending into the forest. Returning to the car grew less certain with every passing minute. This is the moment when the situation likely crossed a threshold. What had begun as an uncomfortable detour became a survival crisis. Cold exposure works quietly. Fingers stiffen, toes numb, dexterity fades, judgment dulls, decision-making slows. Simple tasks become difficult. Time becomes distorted. For men accustomed to structure and predictability, the sudden collapse of routine would have been deeply unsettling. The familiar rules no longer applied. No streetlights, no signs, no schedule to follow. Just cold, darkness, and uncertainty. At some point, at least some of the men left the road itself, moving off into the forest. Why this happened remains unclear. It may have been an attempt to find shelter from wind. It may have been a mistaken belief that cutting through the trees would shorten the journey. Or it may have been driven by desperation. The forest, however, offered no relief. Snow was deeper beneath the trees. Movement became even harder. Branches snagged clothing. Visibility dropped further. Every choice carried a cost. The farther they went, the more limited their options became. At higher elevation, the road curved and climbed. Landmarks disappeared. The sense of direction eroded. The men were now operating without reference points. This is where the case begins to show signs of prolonged survival, because despite everything, they did not collapse immediately. They kept moving. They made decisions. They adapted, however imperfectly. Somewhere ahead, unknown to them at the time, stood a Forest Service trailer, a structure meant for summer use, a place stocked with supplies, a place that could mean the difference between life and death. But it was miles away, and reaching it would require endurance, persistence, and time. Time they did not know they had. As the hours passed, the cold deepened, energy waned, the group fractured further. It is likely that some of the men turned back at this point, or attempted to. Others pressed forward. No one knows who made which decision or when. What is known is that their paths diverged, and once that happened, their chances of survival diverged with them. Back on the valley floor, the night passed quietly. No alarms were raised, no search parties were mobilized. The mountains held their silence. By the time daylight came, the men were no longer simply lost. They were scattered, separated by distance, terrain, and fate. And the road that had led them upward now lay hidden beneath fresh snow, erasing the last visible trace of the moment when everything might still have been undone.
When the Mercury Montego was eventually found, it did not look like the final resting place of a disaster. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no evidence of a collision or mechanical failure. The car sat quietly along the side of the Oroville-Quincy Road, angled near a snowbank, as though it had simply been parked and left behind. It still had fuel in the tank. The battery was functional. The tires were intact. The engine could have been started. This detail cannot be overstated. The car was not disabled. It was not trapped. It was not beyond use. Remaining inside that vehicle would have provided shelter from wind, insulation from cold, and the best possible chance of being seen by passing vehicles or searchers once daylight arrived. Even in freezing temperatures, a stationary vehicle offers protection that walking cannot.
but the 5 men left it. Why they did so remains one of the most difficult questions in the case. There is no evidence that the car became suddenly unsafe, no indication of fire, carbon monoxide buildup, or mechanical danger, no sign that someone forced them out. The keys were missing when the car was found. Whether they were taken intentionally or simply lost is unknown. What matters is that the decision to leave was not compelled by immediate necessity. It was voluntary. Some have suggested the men feared the car would slide off the road. Others believe they thought help was close by. There are theories that confusion, fatigue, or fear distorted their judgment, but none of these explanations fully account for abandoning the most obvious source of safety, especially for Jack Madruga. Jack was known for being protective of his car. He maintained it carefully. He did not leave it unattended without reason. It was not just transportation to him, it was a point of pride and control. Leaving it behind would have gone against his instincts, which suggests that something about the situation felt urgent enough to override that instinct. What that something was remains unknown. The location of the car is also important. It was not parked at the highest point of the road. It was not wedged deep into impassable snow. It was positioned in a place where turning around, while difficult, may have been possible. Other vehicles traveled the same road that night and made it through. This means the conditions, while dangerous, were not uniquely catastrophic. The men were not trapped by nature alone. They were trapped by decisions. Once they left the car, every option narrowed. The farther they walked, the less likely it became that they could return. Snow erased their tracks, darkness concealed landmarks, fatigue dulled judgment. The car became an anchor they severed themselves from. Search and rescue experts have long emphasized a single rule in winter emergencies: stay with the vehicle. Vehicles are visible, they provide shelter, they increase the chances of rescue exponentially. Walking away from one is often fatal. In this case, it was. But that knowledge comes with hindsight. In the moment, fear and confusion can alter perception. The men may have believed they were closer to help than they actually were. They may have underestimated the distance to safety. They may have overestimated their ability to walk through snow. Or they may have believed that stopping meant freezing in place. The cold can convince people that movement is survival. That illusion is powerful. As the men walked away from the car, the last reliable reference point disappeared behind them. They entered a landscape where orientation was fragile and options were limited. Time stretched, energy drained. At some point, the group fractured. Some likely realized the mistake and attempted to return. Others pressed on, believing forward movement was the only option left. The car, meanwhile, sat alone. Snow continued to fall, partially burying it. By morning, it blended into the landscape. Back in Yuba City, February 25th arrived quietly. Families expected the men home overnight. When morning came and they did not return, concern began to surface. Phones rang. Questions were asked. But there was no immediate panic. Delays happened. Oversleeping happened. There was still time. As hours passed, concern grew heavier. The absence no longer felt routine. By afternoon, the families began to realize that something was wrong. The men had commitments, they had schedules, they did not disappear without explanation. By the time authorities were notified, daylight had already passed over the mountains. Snow continued to fall. Any chance of following fresh tracks was slipping away. The abandoned car would not be found until days later, and when it was, it would raise more questions than it answered. Because the car did not tell the story of an accident, it told the story of a choice that turned a survivable mistake into a fatal journey. The moment the 5 men closed the doors behind them and stepped into the snow, the balance shifted. From inconvenience to danger, from danger to uncertainty, and from uncertainty to silence. The mountains do not need violence to claim lives. They only require time. And on that night, time began working against the 5 men the instant they walked away from the car.
By the morning of February 25, 1978, the night's silence had begun to feel wrong. In Yuba City, routines were supposed to resume. Breakfast tables were set, radios turned on, cars left driveways. But 5 men did not return to where they were expected to be. At first, the absence did not trigger an alarm. Delays happened. Oversleeping happened. A missed call was not unheard of. Families waited. Hours passed. As the morning turned into afternoon, concern replaced patience. Jack Madruga's mother knew her son's habits. He did not stay out without calling. He did not abandon plans. His car should have been in the driveway. Ted Weiher had responsibilities that day. He was not someone who simply disappeared. William Sterling's family expected him to follow the schedule he always followed. When he did not, worry began to settle in. Jack Huett's parents knew their son's patterns. He did not wander. He did not deviate without explanation. Gary Mathias had plans of his own. He had told people where he would be. By midday, it became clear that this was not coincidence. Something was wrong. Calls were made between families. Questions were asked. None of the men had been seen. None had contacted anyone. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly. 5 families, separately, began to understand the same thing. Their sons had not come home. Authorities were contacted, but the response was cautious. There was no evidence of a crime, no abandoned vehicle reported yet, no clear location to search. Adults sometimes chose to stay away. Sometimes plans change. Sometimes people left town without notice. Time passed. The delay mattered. Winter in the mountains does not wait for certainty. As the hours slipped by, snow continued to fall along the Oroville-Quincy Road. Tracks that might have been visible in the morning vanished by evening. The window for an immediate rescue narrowed. When the Mercury Montego was finally reported missing and later discovered, days had already passed. By then, any footprints left by the men were gone. Any chance of following their path directly had disappeared beneath fresh snowfall. The car was found abandoned, not wrecked, not damaged beyond use. This discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why would 5 men leave a functioning vehicle? Why would they walk away into winter conditions? Why had no one seen them? The location of the car shifted the focus of the search dramatically. Instead of a missing persons inquiry centered in Yuba City or Chico, the case moved into the mountains, a place vast, unforgiving, and difficult to search even under ideal conditions. Search efforts began in earnest. Volunteers, law enforcement, and rescue teams combed the area around the car. They followed the road. They scanned the forest. But the terrain worked against them. Snow hid everything. Elevation strained endurance. Helicopters were grounded by weather. Visibility was poor. The men could have been anywhere. The search expanded outward in widening circles, but each day that passed reduced the likelihood of finding anyone alive. Despite these efforts, no signs of the men were found. No clothing, no equipment, no bodies. Only silence. For the families, this absence became its own kind of torment. They were suspended between hope and dread. Every passing day raised the same question. If they were alive, why hadn't they been found? And if they were dead, where were they? The mountains offered no answers. Winter tightened its grip. Snowstorms rolled through the region, further complicating the search. As conditions worsened, active efforts were scaled back. The search could not continue indefinitely. Eventually, it had to stop. Spring would have to reveal what winter concealed.
For the families, waiting became the only option. They waited through weeks of uncertainty, through nights without sleep, through days defined by unanswered questions. The knowledge that time had been lost weighed heavily. Had the car been found sooner, things might have been different. Had the alarm been raised earlier, tracks might have been followed. Had help arrived in time, someone might have survived. These thoughts lingered, unspoken but ever present. The men had vanished without a trace, and the longer they remained missing, the more the case shifted from rescue to recovery. By the time winter loosened its grip on the Sierra Nevada, hope had thinned. But it had not disappeared, because until evidence said otherwise, there was still a possibility. Somewhere in the mountains, the 5 men might still be alive, unseen, waiting. As spring approached, the snow began to recede, roads reopened, trails emerged, and the forest prepared to give back what it had taken. But what it revealed would deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. Because when the first answers finally came, they did not arrive together. They arrived out of order. And they would change everything.
Winter in the Sierra Nevada does not end quickly. It lingers. Snow remains packed into shaded forests long after the calendar says spring. Drifts harden into ice. Meltwater refreezes at night. Roads open gradually, cautiously, revealing terrain that has been sealed away for months. For the families of the 5 men, winter stretched endlessly. After search efforts were suspended, silence took their place. There were no updates, no discoveries, no answers. The mountains, which had already hidden the men once, continued to guard their secrets. The terrain itself played a decisive role. The area surrounding the Oroville-Quincy Road is rugged and uneven. Slopes drop sharply. Forest undergrowth conceals everything beneath it. In winter, snow smooths the landscape, masking dips, ravines, and obstacles that would otherwise be visible. Footprints disappear within hours. Clothing blends into white. Sound carries unpredictably. In such conditions, even a thorough search can miss what lies only yards away. The men could have been close. They could have been far. There was no way to know. Helicopter searches, when weather allowed, scanned the forest from above, but snow-covered bodies and debris are nearly invisible against the landscape. Trees block sightlines. Shadows conceal detail. Ground searches were slow and exhausting. Snowshoes sank. Slopes strained muscles. Cold drained energy. Every step cost time. Every day cost hope. As weeks passed, the search area expanded, but certainty did not. There was no clear direction to follow, no confirmed path, no evidence to suggest where the men had gone after leaving the car. The silence became its own presence. For families, this silence was heavier than bad news. It left space for imagination, for fear, for doubt. Each passing day forced them to confront the possibility that the men might never be found. Winter eventually gave way to spring. Snow receded from lower elevations first, revealing ground that had been hidden since February. Roads reopened. Trails became passable. It was during this thaw that answers began to surface. Not all at once, not cleanly. The first signs did not arrive with certainty. Hunters, hikers, and Forest Service employees moved through areas that had been inaccessible for months. They scanned the forest floor for anything out of place. Bones, clothing, unnatural patterns in the landscape. The forest slowly began to give back what it had concealed. But the discoveries did not follow a neat order. They did not form a single narrative. Instead, they appeared in fragments, and each fragment raised new questions. When the Forest Service trailer was finally approached, it was not because searchers expected to find anything there. It was a routine check, a structure reopened after winter, a door unlocked. No one anticipated what waited inside. The trailer sat far from the abandoned car, farther than anyone had expected the men to travel on foot. Its presence alone suggested endurance, intent, survival. When the door opened, the silence that had defined the case broke. Inside was proof that at least one man had lived far longer than anyone had imagined. But the discovery did not bring clarity, it brought contradictions. Because survival, in this case, did not end with rescue. It ended with starvation. And the questions multiplied. How did he get there? Why did he not leave? Why was the food untouched? Why had no one else been found nearby? The months of silence had not preserved the truth, they had distorted it. Time had rearranged the evidence, snow had erased context, and by the time spring revealed the first answers, the opportunity to understand the sequence of events fully was gone. The silence that followed the men into the mountains had done its work. It had broken continuity. It had isolated moments from one another. And now investigators were left trying to reconstruct a story from pieces that no longer fit cleanly together. The discovery of the trailer did not close the case. It reopened, because it proved that the disappearance was not a single-night tragedy. It was a prolonged ordeal, one that unfolded over days and weeks, one that involved choices, endurance, and isolation, and one that would soon reveal just how far those choices had carried the 5 men. What came next would change the understanding of everything that came before, because the man found in that trailer had not been alone, and the evidence would soon show that others had survived longer than anyone believed possible.
The Forest Service trailer stood quietly in the mountains, just as it always had. It was not hidden, it was not buried, it was simply far away, positioned along a route few people traveled and unreachable during the winter months. When spring came and access was restored, the trailer became one of many structures reopened after months of isolation. No one expected it to hold answers. When the door was opened, the air inside was stale and unmoving. The cold lingered, trapped within the metal walls. At first glance, nothing appeared out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no broken furniture. The room was orderly. At the center of the space was a bed. On that bed lay the body of Ted Weiher. He was wrapped tightly in blankets, layered carefully as though someone had taken time to keep him warm. His body was severely emaciated. By the time he was found, he weighed approximately 100 pounds, having lost nearly half his body weight. The official cause of death would later be determined to be starvation. This conclusion stunned investigators. Ted had not suffered from freezing to death. He had not suffered a sudden injury. He had survived long enough for hunger to take over. The details inside the trailer made the situation even more difficult to comprehend. The windows had been broken deliberately, not shattered in panic, but cracked intentionally, one at a time. Paper and cloth had been stuffed into the openings, likely in an attempt to control airflow or retain heat. This was not the behavior of someone in a confused or unconscious state. It suggested awareness, planning. The stove had been used. The propane tank was present. The trailer contained ample food supplies, dozens of unopened cans, military-style rations, and dehydrated meals, enough to sustain someone for weeks, possibly longer. None of it had been eaten. Ted's beard had grown long, his hair was unkempt. These details suggested he had been alive for a significant period of time after reaching the trailer. The bed itself showed signs of prolonged use. This was not a place someone had collapsed and died immediately. It was a place where someone had waited. Investigators were left with a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Why did Ted not eat the food? There was no evidence that he was physically unable to open the cans. He was not injured in a way that would have prevented him from feeding himself. Some have suggested that fear, confusion, or emotional distress may have played a role. Others have speculated about psychological factors influenced by extreme stress and isolation. But none of these explanations fully account for the deliberate actions Ted had taken inside the trailer. He had used the stove, he had attempted to insulate the windows, he had wrapped himself in blankets. These actions required thought and effort. They indicated that Ted was not entirely incapacitated, and yet he starved. Another unsettling detail was the presence of multiple sleeping arrangements. Blankets and bedding were arranged in ways that suggested more than one person had been inside the trailer at some point. This indicated that Ted may have arrived alone, or that others had come and gone. The timeline grew more complex. The trailer was located miles beyond where the abandoned car had been found. The distance between the two locations suggested that at least some of the men had traveled far deeper into the mountains than initially believed. This meant endurance, movement, survival beyond the first night. The discovery of Ted's body forced investigators to reevaluate earlier assumptions. The men had not perished quickly in the snow. At least one of them had lived for weeks, possibly longer. This revelation reframed the entire case. What had been thought of as a tragic, short-lived ordeal was now understood as a prolonged struggle, one that involved shelter, adaptation, and sustained effort. Yet the outcome defied logic. Ted had reached safety, he had warmth, he had food, and still he died. The presence of untouched supplies created a haunting paradox. Everything needed to survive was there, everything except the ability to use it. Whether that inability was physical, psychological, or circumstantial remains unknown. The trailer also raised questions about the others. If Ted had been there, where were the remaining 4 men? Had they arrived together? Had they separated before reaching the trailer? Had some left in search of help? The answers were not immediately clear. What was clear was that the discovery of the trailer marked a turning point. The case was no longer about a mysterious disappearance. It was about survival, isolation, and choices made under extreme conditions. The forest had finally yielded one of its secrets, but instead of clarity, it delivered a deeper mystery. Because Ted Weir's death did not fit any simple narrative. It suggested endurance without resolution, effort without escape, and choices that remain impossible to fully understand. The trailer, meant to provide shelter, had become a place of waiting, a place where time stretched and hope diminished, a place where survival was possible but never achieved. As investigators processed the scene, they understood that this discovery was not the end. It was the beginning of a new phase. Because the evidence inside the trailer suggested that Ted was not the only one who had survived beyond the initial night. Others had been there. Others had moved, and somewhere beyond the trailer, the forest still held the rest of the story. What would be found next would only deepen the unanswered questions, and it would confirm that the tragedy of the Yuba County 5 unfolded not in a single moment, but over time, in fragments scattered across the mountains. The discovery of Ted Weir inside the Forest Service trailer changed the assumptions of the case, but it did not answer its most important questions. Instead, it opened new ones. As investigators examined the interior more closely, they noticed details that suggested Ted had not been alone during his time there. Multiple blankets had been arranged in different areas of the trailer, not just on the bed. Some were folded. Others were laid out separately, as though more than one person had attempted to sleep inside the space. The positioning of the bedding did not suggest a single occupant moving restlessly. It suggested shared use. There were signs that the stove had been operated on more than one occasion. The propane tank showed usage beyond what would have been required for a brief stay. Someone had broken the windows deliberately, but the pattern of insulation implied repeated adjustment over time, as though the occupants were responding to changing conditions. These were not the actions of a man who arrived alone, lay down, and died. They were signs of continued presence, movement, survival. The timeline began to stretch.
Investigators estimated that Ted Weiher may have lived for weeks after reaching the trailer. This estimate was based on his physical condition, the growth of his hair and beard, and the state of the bedding and interior environment. Weeks. That word altered everything. If Ted survived that long, then the ordeal was not limited to a single night of panic and exposure. It was an extended struggle that unfolded slowly, shaped by decisions made day after day. And if Ted survived for weeks, then others may have as well. Outside the trailer, the terrain revealed subtle clues. Footwear impressions were inconsistent, difficult to interpret, and partially eroded by time and weather, but some suggested movement beyond what had been expected. Items found along the route between the abandoned car and the trailer hinted at passage. Not a straight line, not a single march, but staggered movement. Stops, starts. This suggested that the group did not travel together all the way. They separated at different points. Some may have reached the trailer, others may have turned back, some may have attempted to find help. The evidence did not indicate chaos, it indicated fragmentation. One of the most troubling elements was the absence of urgency. There were no clear signs that anyone had attempted to leave a message, no notes, no markings, no deliberate signals left behind. This absence raised questions. Did the men believe rescue was imminent? Did they believe they would survive on their own? Or did exhaustion and confusion simply erode the ability to plan beyond the next hour? Inside the trailer, the food remained untouched. This detail remained the most haunting. The presence of sustenance meant survival was possible, yet the inability to use it suggested something more complex than physical exhaustion. It pointed to psychological collapse, or dependency, or an unspoken rule that no one broke. Ted Weiher, in particular, had relied heavily on routine and structure throughout his life. Sudden change caused him distress. Unfamiliar environments overwhelmed him. Inside the trailer, surrounded by supplies but lacking direction, he may have been paralyzed by uncertainty. But that explanation alone does not account for everything. Because others had been there, others had moved, others had the capacity to act. Why did no one take charge? Why did no one leave to find help and return? Why did survival stretch on without resolution? The possibility that Mathias was present at the trailer briefly added another layer to the mystery. Gary was the most capable member of the group. He had military training, he was physically strong, he was independent. If Gary reached the trailer, it raises immediate questions. Why did he leave Ted behind? Why did he not bring food to him? Why did he not seek help more aggressively? No clear evidence places Gary definitively inside the trailer, but the signs suggest his presence nearby. This uncertainty has fueled speculation for decades. The trailer had become a crossroads, a place of temporary refuge, a point where choices were made. And from that point, the paths diverged again. The story of the Yuba County Five is not one of collective survival or collective failure. It is one of individuals responding differently to the same crisis. Some pressed forward, some waited, some may have turned back. The evidence suggests that at least two of the men remained together for a time after leaving the car. Others separated earlier. Each separation reduced the likelihood of coordinated survival. Each increased isolation. As investigators continued to search the surrounding area, the forest began to reveal more. No answers, but confirmations of loss. The discovery of Ted Weiher proved that the men had endured longer than anyone had believed. What followed would confirm that endurance did not guarantee rescue, because beyond the trailer, the forest held more remains, and each discovery would further complicate the story. The next bodies would be found miles away, scattered across terrain that told a story of exhaustion, collapse, and separation. And one of the five would remain absent entirely. The case was no longer about what happened to five men together. It was about what happened to five men apart. And the deeper investigators went,
the more apparent it became that no single explanation could account for all of it. The forest had not claimed them at once. It had taken them one by one.
The next discoveries came quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden clarity, just pieces of a story emerging from the forest, scattered and incomplete. Months after the trailer was found, searchers began to locate human remains farther down the mountain, in areas that had only recently become accessible. Snow had melted back enough to reveal ground that had been hidden since winter. The first remains belonged to William Sterling. Bill was found miles from the Forest Service trailer, along a route that suggested he had not reached shelter. His body lay in the open, exposed to the elements, with no sign that he had found meaningful refuge. The location of his remains told a story of movement. Bill had traveled a considerable distance after leaving the car. He had not collapsed immediately. He had continued on, step by step, through snow and cold, until his body could go no farther. There was no evidence of violence, no sign of a struggle. The cause of death was exposure. Bill Sterling had not been able to outrun the conditions. Not far from where Bill was found, searchers located the remains of Jack Huett. Jack, like Bill, had succumbed to the elements. His body was discovered in a position that suggested exhaustion rather than panic. He had not sheltered himself successfully. He had not reached safety. The distance between Bill and Jack's remains suggested that they had been together for part of the journey, or at least moving in the same general direction, before ultimately failing under the same conditions. These discoveries confirmed what investigators had suspected. The men had not all traveled together after leaving the car. Some had moved toward the trailer. Others had not made it that far. Bill and Jack had survived long enough to walk miles into the wilderness, but not long enough to escape it. Their deaths were not sudden. They were prolonged. They involved effort, endurance, and gradual collapse. For the families, these discoveries brought devastating clarity. The hope that their loved ones might still be alive faded, but the relief of certainty did not arrive. Instead, the findings raised new questions. Why had Bill and Jack not reached the trailer? Why had they continued moving instead of waiting? Had they known about the shelter ahead, or had they been following a different belief about where safety lay? The trail between the abandoned car and the trailer was not linear. It curved, it climbed, it disappeared into the forest. The men did not have a map. They did not know where the trailer was. They were walking without knowledge of what lay ahead. That ignorance mattered, because it meant that every step forward was a gamble. Bill and Jack had gambled on movement. They had lost. The third absence became impossible to ignore. Jackie Madruga, the driver, was never found. Despite extensive searches, no remains definitively linked to him were recovered. No clothing, no personal items. Jackie's disappearance remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. He had been the most cautious, the most protective of the car, the least likely to wander far without reason, and yet he vanished without a trace. Some have suggested that Jackie may have attempted to return to the car. Others believe he may have taken a different route entirely. There is also the possibility that his remains lie undiscovered, concealed by terrain or lost to time. But no evidence has ever confirmed his fate. The absence of Jackie's body created a gap that no explanation could fill. It also reinforced the sense that the men's decisions diverged sharply after leaving the car. Each man responded differently. Some pressed forward, some waited, some may have turned back. The discovery of Bill and Jack's remains further complicated the timeline. Their bodies were found at distances that suggested they had survived for days, but not weeks. This contrasted sharply with Ted Weir's prolonged survival inside the trailer. The staggered nature of these deaths made it impossible to construct a single narrative. The men did not perish together. They did not perish the same way. They did not make the same choices.
This fragmentation is what continues to haunt the case. If all 5 had died together near the car, the explanation might have been straightforward. If all 5 had reached the trailer and died there, the mystery might have centered on one shared failure. But that is not what happened. Instead, the forest scattered them. Each discovery told a different story of fear, endurance, and loss. And still, one man remained unaccounted for. Gary Mathias, the most capable, the one many believed would have survived, the one whose absence complicated every theory. As investigators closed in on what they could recover, the focus shifted toward Gary. If anyone had the ability to escape the mountains, it was him. If anyone had the capacity to find help, it was him. And if anyone could explain the choices made inside the trailer, it was him. But Gary Mathias was gone, and his disappearance would become the deepest mystery of all. Because unlike the others, Gary left behind just enough evidence to suggest survival, and not enough to explain what happened next.
Gary Mathias should have survived. That belief has lingered at the center of this case for decades. Among the 5 men, Gary was different. He was physically fit. He had military experience. He had lived independently. He understood unfamiliar environments and had navigated difficult situations before. If anyone had the skills to find help, it was Gary. And yet, he was the one who vanished most completely. Gary's history mattered. He had served in the U.S. Army, stationed overseas. He had experience with cold, with hardship, with following procedures under stress. He was not naive about danger. He also lived with schizophrenia and was prescribed medication to manage his condition. When medicated, he functioned well. He worked, he socialized, he planned. On the night the men vanished, Gary's medication was reportedly left behind in Yuba City. This detail has fueled speculation. Some believe the lack of medication may have affected his decision-making. Others argue that his behavior after leaving the car suggests clarity and capability, not disorientation. What is known is that Gary was wearing tennis shoes that night. In the mountains, shoes matter. When searchers examined the area around the Forest Service trailer, they found a pair of tennis shoes inside. The shoes were Gary's size, but they were not definitively linked to him. This discovery raised unsettling possibilities. Had Gary reached the trailer? Had he removed his shoes to dry them or rest? Had he left them behind intentionally? Or had they belonged to someone else entirely? The presence of those shoes inside the trailer suggested movement and agency. Someone had entered. Someone had stayed long enough to leave personal items behind. Someone had then left again. Gary's physical capabilities made his absence difficult to accept. If he had reached the trailer, he would have known that food and shelter meant survival. If he had been there with Ted Weiher, he would have understood the urgency of eating, of maintaining strength, of planning an escape. Why would he leave Ted behind? Why would he not take food with him? Why would he not return with help? These questions have no confirmed answers. One possibility is that Gary believed he could find help faster by continuing onward. The trailer was remote, but the road beyond it led toward other areas. Gary may have assumed that walking further would bring him to civilization. If that is the case, his decision would have been rational, but it would also have been fatal. Another possibility is that Gary became disoriented. Cold, exhaustion, and lack of medication can alter perception. Judgment can degrade gradually without obvious signs of panic. But even this explanation struggles to account for the deliberate actions observed at the trailer. The insulation, the stove usage, the bedding arrangements. These details suggest moments of clarity. Gary's disappearance also raised the possibility that he survived beyond the time frame of the others. Some have speculated that he may have made it out of the mountains only to disappear elsewhere. This theory, however, lacks evidence.
There were no reported sightings, no confirmed contacts, no financial or social activity linked to him after the disappearance. The mountains did not give him back, and the world beyond them did not recognize his return. Another troubling detail was the lack of Gary's remains. In cases of exposure, bodies are usually found eventually, clothing, bones, something. But in Gary's case, nothing definitive has ever been recovered. This absence leaves a void in the narrative. It also prevents closure. Without Gary's fate, the story cannot be fully told. He may have died farther from the search area. He may have taken a route that concealed his remains permanently. He may have fallen into terrain that hid him completely. Or he may have survived longer than anyone realized. Each possibility introduces new questions. If Gary survived, why did he not contact anyone? If he died, why was nothing found? The unanswered nature of these questions has allowed theories to flourish. But theories are not answers. What remains is the stark reality that Gary Mathias, despite his skills and experience, vanished in a landscape that punished even small mistakes. His absence underscores the unpredictable nature of survival. Capability does not guarantee safety. Experience does not prevent error, and strength does not always overcome circumstance. Gary's story is the final piece of the physical mystery. Without it, the case remains incomplete, because to understand why the 5 men made the choices they did, one voice is missing, the one most likely to explain, the one most likely to have understood what was happening, and the one who never came back to tell it. With Gary gone, investigators were left to speculate, and speculation would soon dominate the narrative. As the physical search reached its limits, attention turned toward explanation, toward theories, toward attempts to impose order on a story that refused to settle. But every theory would face the same problem. None could account for everything.
As the physical search reached its limits, the case entered a different phase. When evidence stops yielding answers, theories begin to take their place. Over the years, investigators, journalists, psychologists, and the families themselves have examined every known detail, trying to impose order on a story that resists it. The first and most common explanation is disorientation. According to this theory, the men became lost after making a wrong turn, panicked in worsening weather, and made a series of poor decisions driven by fear and confusion. Disorientation explains the initial mistake. It explains continuing up the mountain. It explains abandoning the car. But it struggles to explain endurance. It does not account for Ted Weiher surviving weeks inside a shelter stocked with food. It does not explain deliberate insulation of windows. It does not explain why no one ate. And it does not explain why Gary Mathias disappeared entirely. Another theory centers on psychological stress. Supporters of this explanation suggest that fear, exhaustion, and unfamiliar surroundings overwhelmed the men's ability to reason. Group dynamics under stress can amplify uncertainty. One poor decision can cascade into many. This theory accounts for fragmentation. It explains why the men separated. It explains paralysis and inaction. But it falters when confronted with evidence of planning and sustained effort. Breaking windows carefully, operating a stove, surviving for weeks. These actions require clarity, not collapse. Another theory focuses on Gary Mathias. Some have suggested that his mental health condition, combined with lack of medication, triggered paranoia or erratic behavior that influenced the group's decisions. This explanation attempts to account for the abrupt turn into the mountains and the abandonment of the car, but it relies heavily on assumption.
There is no evidence of violent behavior, no signs of conflict, no proof that Gary controlled or coerced the others, and it does not explain why the others continued to make independent choices after separating from him. Another theory proposes an external encounter. Perhaps the men encountered someone or something on the road that frightened them, a perceived threat, a misunderstanding, an encounter that compelled them to leave the car. This theory explains urgency, it explains fear, but it lacks evidence. No witnesses reported suspicious activity, no signs of struggle were found near the car, no physical traces suggest outside involvement. The forest kept no such secret. A simpler explanation points to environmental inevitability. Snow, cold, fatigue. This view holds that the men succumbed to exposure after underestimating the conditions. But this explanation collapses under the weight of survival evidence. Exposure alone does not explain untouched food. It does not explain prolonged sheltering. It does not explain why no rescue was never attempted once survival was possible. Some have suggested that the men followed the wrong road believing it led home, that exhaustion dulled their ability to recognize the mistake. By the time they realized the error, turning back felt more dangerous than pressing forward. This explanation fits early events, but not the later ones. It cannot account for the choices made inside the trailer. It cannot account for the divergence of outcomes. Each theory explains something. None explain everything. That is the defining feature of the Yuba County Five. It is not a case of missing information. It is a case of conflicting information. Every attempt to simplify it creates new contradictions. Every attempt to assign a single cause leaves evidence behind. The men were not reckless enough for pure accident, not panicked enough for pure chaos, not incapacitated enough for helplessness, and not guided enough for a coordinated plan. They existed in a space between, a space where fear, confusion, routine, and capability collided, and in that collision, logic fractured. The most haunting realization is that no single moment doomed them. There was no instant catastrophe, no dramatic turning point. The tragedy unfolded slowly, choice by choice, step by step. The men were not overtaken by the mountain all at once. They were worn down by it, separated by it, isolated by it, and finally claimed by it. This is why the case refuses resolution, because resolution requires a clear chain of cause and effect, and this story does not offer one. Instead, it offers fragments, survival without escape, movement without direction, capability without outcome. Theories provide comfort. They give shape to uncertainty. But in this case, comfort is fleeting, because every theory ends at the same place, with unanswered questions and one final truth. Something essential about that night remains unknown. Something happened between Chico and the mountains. Something in the darkness altered judgment, and whatever it was, it left no trace that could survive winter. With the evidence exhausted and explanations incomplete, the case drifted into history, but it did not fade because the families did not forget, and the questions did not stop being asked. What remained was not just a mystery, it was a legacy, one shaped by absence and by the quiet certainty that the full truth was never recovered from the forest.
When the searches ended and the theories settled into place, the families were left with what no investigation could resolve: absence. For them, the case did not close when the evidence ran out. It continued in the quiet spaces left behind. Empty chairs, unused bedrooms, holidays that arrived without explanation. They did not receive a single story they could hold on to. They received fragments. One son was found here, another found there, one never found at all, and a series of decisions that no one could fully explain. For the families of Ted Weiher, William Sterling, and Jack Huett, grief came with confirmation. They were able to bury their loved ones, to mark a place, to acknowledge an ending, even if the path to it made no sense. For Jackie Madruga's family, there was no such certainty, no remains, no final moment, just the knowledge that he walked into the mountains and never returned. For Gary Mathias's family, the pain carried a different weight. Gary's disappearance resisted every category. He was neither confirmed dead nor plausibly alive. His absence remained suspended between possibility and loss. Hope became something dangerous. It lingered longer than it should have, and when it finally faded, it left behind questions that could never be answered. The case entered the public imagination quietly. There were no dramatic revelations, no confessions, no hidden evidence uncovered decades later. What remained were discussions, debates, maps, reconstructed timelines. Each attempt to understand the case brought attention back to the same truth, that the story never resolves itself. The mountains remain unchanged. The road still winds upward. The trailer still stands. The landscape offers no explanation for why 5 ordinary men, bound by routine and trust, ended up scattered across its slopes. The Yuba County 5 are not remembered because of spectacle. They're remembered because of contradictions, because survival was possible but did not occur, because strength did not guarantee escape, because help existed but was never reached. Their story challenges assumptions about human behavior under stress, about how fear interacts with routine, about how logic can fracture without breaking entirely. It is tempting to search for a single cause, a single moment, a single error, but this case resists that impulse. The truth, if it exists in full, is likely a combination of small misjudgments compounded by environment, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Not a dramatic failure, but a quiet unraveling. One choice led to another. One step followed the next, and eventually there were no good options left. The forest does not need malice. It does not need intention. It only needs time. Time to erase tracks, time to isolate, time to transform confusion into fatal consequences. The legacy of the Yuba County 5 is not a warning meant to frighten. It is a reminder that ordinary nights can turn irreversible, that familiar people can make unfamiliar decisions, and that survival is not always about strength or intelligence, but about circumstance. The men were not reckless. They were not foolish. They were not villains or heroes. They were human. And what happened to them does not fit neatly into a lesson. It remains unresolved, incomplete, interrupted. The families continue to remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived, as sons, brothers, friends, men who followed routines, men who trusted one another, men who went to a basketball game and never came home. In the end, the mountains kept what they took. They did not give the truth back. And perhaps that is why this case endures, because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered, quietly, respectfully, and without pretending that every story has an ending that makes sense. True crime unforgettable. Share this story. Keep their names alive, because somewhere, someone still knows what happened to the 5 men from Yuba City.